Hello, history lovers. Today we're going to talk about something that might make you think twice before romanticizing the Victorian era: working during the Victorian period. While we often hear about the grandeur of Victorian mansions or the elegance of high society, the reality for most people, especially workers, was much darker. So grab your top hats, because we're about to dive into why working in the Victorian era was a nightmare. The Victorian era, which lasted from 1837 to 1901, was a time of major industrialization. Factories were popping up left and right, and while this led to the birth of many new products and innovations, it also brought about some of the worst working conditions imaginable. Imagine this: long, grueling workdays, often starting at dawn and lasting until dusk. And we're not talking about an 8-hour workday here. Workers in Victorian factories typically laboured for 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, no weekends, no paid time off. And if you think that's bad, wait, this was just the beginning. These factories weren't the clean, efficient places we might think of today. No, they were dangerous, overcrowded, and often poorly ventilated. Workers, both adults and children, were surrounded by large, clunky machines, many of which were unguarded and prone to malfunction. So, what happens when you put human beings in an environment like this? You get accidents. In fact, workplace injuries were so common that people would often lose limbs or worse, die on the job. And if you were injured? Well, tough luck. There was no compensation, little to no workers' rights. If you were lucky enough to survive an accident, you would likely be out of work with no support system in place. Now, if you're thinking, okay, that's rough, but what about pay? Well, get ready to be disappointed. Victorian factory workers were paid barely enough to survive. Men, women, and children all worked for low wages, and if you were a woman or child, you were paid even less. The pay wasn't just low, it was unfair by any standard. Imagine working 12 hours a day in dangerous conditions for less than what you'd need to even buy a decent meal. And remember, even though the work was physically exhausting, there was no such thing as overtime pay. So if you worked extra hours, you weren't getting anything more than what you'd already earned, which wasn't much. Now, where did all these poor, overworked individuals live? Well, after a long day at the factory, most workers went home to tiny, overcrowded slums with no running water or proper sanitation. The buildings were often in disrepair, and disease spread quickly in such unsanitary conditions. The lack of proper sanitation was a huge issue during the Victorian era. Cholera, typhus, and tuberculosis were rampant in these slums. So not only were workers struggling with long hours and dangerous work, but they were also battling illness just by trying to survive. If you got sick, which was incredibly likely, you couldn't just take a sick day and rest. You'd either have to work through the pain or risk being fired. There were no sick leave policies or health insurance, and doctors weren't exactly abundant or affordable. So, if you weren't careful, something like a small cough could quickly turn into a life-threatening illness. Now let's talk about child labour. This was one of the most shocking and disturbing aspects of Victorian factory life. Children, some as young as 5 or 6, were put to work in the same harsh conditions as adults. Many children worked in factories, coal mines, and textile mills for incredibly long hours. They were paid a fraction of what adults earned and given tasks that were dangerous and exhausting. Children often worked in confined spaces where adults couldn't fit, like crawling through tight tunnels in mines or cleaning cotton machinery in mills. And if you think there were regulations to protect children, think again. There were very few laws at the time protecting young workers, and those that existed weren't enforced properly. So for these children, their lives were spent in a cycle of work, illness, and, often, death. The worst part? These workers had no voice. Labour unions were still a distant dream. So workers had little power to negotiate better wages, shorter hours, or improved working conditions. If you complained, you could easily be replaced. There was always someone else desperate for work, so Survival meant putting up with the harshest conditions imaginable. So, to sum it all up, working in the Victorian era was brutal. Long hours, low pay, dangerous conditions, child labour, and no safety nets if things went wrong. Whether you were working in a factory, on a farm, or in a mine, life was hard. The Industrial Revolution brought innovation, but it came at a human cost that we often forget when we look back on those romanticised images of Victorian life. Thank you for watching this episode of Earthly Wonders. Please like and subscribe to support this channel.